Reporting the news, the mainstream puppet press dare not report, July 18th, 2009. Just to finish up a little bit on the swine flu pandemic, it was also reported this week, CNS News, healthcare bill will fund state vaccine teams to conduct interventions in private homes. There's a knock at the front door. Peeking through the window, a mother sees a man and a woman, both in uniform. They're agents of the healthcare reform. There to give you the immunization if you did not report to the mass vaccination, which, in light of the fact that the government has taken over the healthcare system, this could easily become a requirement. This kind of scenario may not seem quite so far-fetched.
Yeah, no surprises there when, 10 million people are laid up in the hospital with the swine flu. The government's going to say, well, it's just mandatory. That's just it. We have to do something.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to continue with the news, and so go ahead and get us started, Brian.
Yesterday was the 6-year anniversary of the very mysterious death of Dr. David Kelly, so I wanted to go into his story here today. It's a little bit lengthy, but it certainly deserves attention. It's gotten very little in mainstream media. The article I'm going to read is actually by Norman Baker. He was a MP in the British Parliament, and he actually resigned his position to write a book about this and do some investigation into it. Why I know weapons expert David Kelly was murdered, by Norman Baker. For Tony Blair, it was a glorious day. He was in the United States being feted by the U.S. Congress and President Bush. Their adulation was such that he was being offered the rare honor of a Congressional Gold Medal. Naturally enough, Bush and his administration were hugely grateful for Blair's decision to join the United States in the invasion of Iraq. But that invasion was supposed to lead to the discovery and disposal of weapons of mass destruction and make the world a safer place. But as Blair was lapping up the grateful plaudits from the U.S. Congress on July 17, 2003, the man who had done more than any other individual on earth to contain the threat from weapons of mass destruction, lay dead in the woods at Harrowdown Hill in Oxfordshire. For David Kelly, the UK's leading weapons inspector, there would be no praise, no medal, and no standing ovation. His life ended the cold, lonely wood where he was found the next morning, his left wrist cut open, nearly 3 empty packs of painkillers in his jacket pocket. His death was, of course, sensational front-page news. Dr. Kelly, unknown to almost everybody at the beginning of that July, had in recent days barely been absent from media headlines. Much to his chagrin, he had been thrust into the harsh glare of publicity, accused of being the mole who expressed to the BBC deep concerns about the government's, quote, sexing up of its dossier on weapons of mass destruction. For Blair, accused of misusing, exaggerating, or even inventing intelligence in order to justify the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, the stakes could not have been higher. This was undoubtedly the greatest crisis of his premiership to date. To add fuel to the flames, Tony Blair's Director of Communications, Alastair Campbell, had launched an unprecedented and venomous attack on the BBC, questioning its integrity and professionalism in the way it reported the story. Suddenly finding himself under tremendous personal pressure, it seemed that Dr. Kelly had buckled and decided to commit suicide. That, at the least, was the official version of the events, as decided by the Hutton inquiry set up by the government with lightning speed within hours of his death. But the more I examined it, the more it became clear to me that Hutton's judgment was faulty and suspect in virtually all important respects. Increasingly concerned, I decided to give up my post on the Liberal Democrat front bench to look into Dr. Kelly's death. My investigations have since convinced me that it is clinically impossible for Dr. Kelly to have died by his own hand, and that both his personality and other circumstantial evidence strongly mitigate against suicide. Given that his death was clearly not an accident, that leaves only one alternative, that he must have been murdered. This is not a conclusion I have come to lightly. I simply set out to examine the facts, to test the evidence, and to follow the trial wherever it took me. It was sobering to be given such a clear indication that Dr. Kelly had been murdered, but the scientist himself appears to have been fully aware that his work made him a target for assassins. British diplomat David Brockner told the Hutton Inquiry that some months before Dr. Kelly's death, he even asked him what would happen if Iraq were invaded. Rather chillingly, Dr. Kelly replied that he would, quote, probably be found dead in the woods.
Wow.
At the inquiry, this was constructed as meaning that he had already had suicidal thoughts. That, of course, is blatantly absurd. In his report, Hutton declared that the principal cause of death was bleeding from a self-inflicted knife wound on Dr. Kelly's left wrist. Yet Dr. Nicholas Hunt, the pathologist who carried out the post-mortem examination on Dr. Kelly, stated that the cut had only been one blood vessel, the ulnar artery. Since the arteries in the wrist are matchstick thickness, severing just one of them does not lead to a life-threatening blood loss, especially if it's cut crossways, the method apparently adopted by Dr. Kelly, rather than its length. The artery simply retracts and stops bleeding. As a scientist who would have known more about human anatomy than most, Dr. Kelly particularly unlikely to have targeted the ulnar artery. Buried deep in the wrist, it can only be accessed through the extremely painful process of cutting through nerves and tendons. Mai Peterson, a close friend of Dr. Kelly, has confirmed that he hated all types of pills and had a hatred of swallowing even a headache pill. Yet we are told that he took 3 packs, each containing 10 of the Copraxil painkillers that his wife Janice took for her arthritis. Stranger still, tests revealed the presence of only the equivalent of 1/5 of one pill in Dr. Kelly's stomach, even allowing for natural metabolizing. This cannot easily be reconciled with the idea that he swallowed 29 of them. As for his state of mind, in the eyes of those who knew them well, he was the last person that was expected to take his own life. His emotional state certainly did not appear to give any major cause for alarm the morning of that Thursday he disappeared. The emails he sent home suggested that his mood was rather upbeat, and he had actually scheduled to travel to Baghdad the following week. Indeed, so keen was Dr. Kelly to get back to Iraq, he spoke to Wing Commander John Clark at the Ministry of Defense about when he could return. A trip was booked for him the following Friday in his diary, recovered by the police, which the people that are about to kill themselves do not generally book an airline ticket in flight for a flight they have no intention of taking. Since none of this fits a police profile of a man that's about to commit suicide, we are faced with an obvious question. If Dr. Kelly did not kill himself, then who might have been responsible for his death?
Well, it's a very interesting story, and there's probably a lot more information on that if someone wants to look into it. Infowars.com. Any other websites you'd recommend?
Well, I mean, just go Google Dr. David Kelly, and it'll just start coming up, all the information. It's extraordinary that the chief weapons inspector blowing the whistle to the BBC that weapons of mass destruction do not exist in Iraq right after the invasion suddenly is murdered.
That's an amazing story. After the break, we're going to do a little background on Bill Cooper and next week's guest. We're going to play a clip for you, and then we will go to the phone calls. You are listening to The Real News with Farron and Brian. We'll be back in 3 minutes. We're back on The Real News Radio, Farron and Brian. Next week, our guest is going to be Doyle Shamley. If you're not familiar with this name, Bill Cooper, a world-renowned researcher, author, radio show host, late 80s, all the way through the 90s, broke some of the major facts of our government being led by occultists, secret societies, all the way through history. I mean, some of the best information that's ever been brought to light, this guy was leading the way. His story is a very interesting story. If you're new to this, Bill Cooper was attempted to be arrested on September 11th, 2001. June 28, 2001, he announced there was going to be a false flag attack in America and it blamed on Osama bin Laden. Now, that is 3 months prior to the event.